This morning we are jumping we're jumping back into the waters of John's Gospel, and we're going to jump a few verses ahead of where Tony left us. So Tony left us last week at the end of chapter 5, and we're going to jump 16 or so verses, and Rachel's going to pick up that text next week because what she's going to do is pair that text, verses 1 through 15 in chapter 6, 1 through 15, and then she's going to pick up this after the story that I'm going to talk about today, 22 all the way through 71. So Rachel is basically going to just recite scripture to you next week because that's a long set of text. But it's going to be good because in it you'll hear a lot of bread references. It's where Jesus feeds the 5,000, and then after the story that I tell today or talk about today, Jesus is going to use that first I am statement that John is famous for, the 7 statements of I am that Jesus uses in John's Gospel. And the first of those is I am the bread of life. So Rachel's going to pair the story of the feeding of the 5,000 and the I am statement of I am the bread of life. But sandwiched right in between those stories are 6 verses, roughly 6 verses that I will focus in on today. And we're going to dive into a little bit more of the context as we explore the text, but to give us a reference point, the story is that we're coming right off of the feeding of the 5,000, and there's a crowd that gathers, and they're really stirred up by what Jesus has just done, and they want to make Jesus an earthly king. And that's where we pick up the story today, and the story today is a story that we all know, Jesus walking on the water. The miracle is recorded in 3 of the 4 Gospels. John shares it, Mark and Matthew also share it. Now, I've been careful to note throughout this whole series thus far in John's Gospel that we're not supposed to take other parts of the other stories to put them in the story, that we could use them to inform us, but we're not supposed to read more into John's story because the way John tells the story is important for us because John wants us to know something specific about who Jesus is. In fact, 92% of John's gospel is original to John. So I think when John uses stories that are used in other gospels, I think it's interesting for us to look at those stories a little bit differently because he's putting them in for a reason. 8% of his whole gospel is something that he shares with the other gospel writers. So my feeling is we have to spend a little bit more time thinking, why does he do that? And are there parallels to the story? Are there things in those other stories that can help us understand a little bit more about what John is trying to tell us? Now, each of the accounts of this story, of the miracle of the walking on water, are similar, but they're different. And it's in their differences that we can piece those things together. I think we understand a little bit more about who John is through John, or who Jesus is through John's eyes. So this morning, we're going to be in John chapter 6, and we're going to start with verse 16 through 18. When evening came, his disciples went down to the lake, where they got into a boat and set off across the lake for Capernaum. By now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them. A strong wind was blowing, and the waters grew rough. So Jesus just does this incredible miracle on the hillside, feeds 5,000 people. And the disciples, they're probably on this adrenaline high from being a part of this really cool experience. And they get into a boat, this is what John tells us, they get into a boat and they head to Capernaum. Now this lake that they're heading into in the dark in the storm is actually the Sea of Galilee. The Sea of Galilee is a big body of water. It's 13 miles long and 8 miles wide. So it's really big. It's like bigger than Lake Geneva big. Like you can see to the other side, but it's still big. There are things that we know about the Sea of Galilee up until this point, but John, he calls it a lake, but scholars say it's the Sea of Galilee. So they are on the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee, if you can picture yourself a big, like, oval shape of a lake. And they're on the eastern side of the lake. Where they are exactly, it's not clear, but they're on the eastern side. And Jesus is sending them to Capernaum, which is on the northwestern part of the lake. And if you drew a straight line, they could be anywhere from 4 to 6 miles away from where they start to where they are going. So that gives us a context as to distance, and it would probably be a really nice boat trip on a sunny day with little to no wind. But they don't set out with ideal conditions, do they? They aren't able to just go on a joyride for the day. When they head out, it's already windy, John tells us, and the waters were already pretty choppy. And John tells us that it was already dark. Now, if you've ever traveled in a boat, not like a cruise ship, but a small vessel in any kind of rough waters, and it's windy, you know how difficult that this would have been. You would have had to hug the shoreline the best you could because there's no really easy way of going any distance in big open waters when it's choppy. However, unlike me and maybe you, but I don't want to speak for your boating expertise because I don't know how good of a small vessel captain you might be. But for me, the situation is unlike what it would have been for me. Because many of the 12 disciples, they were fishermen. They were professional boaters. They dealt with water like this in dark waters like this. But it doesn't mean that it was easy. It just means that they have some sort of idea of how to do this. But it was still difficult. And they've been dealing with this for a while. Scholars say, based on the language that John uses, that they would have been at this 6 to 8 hours by the time Jesus shows up. 6 to 8 hours of really strenuous work rowing a boat in the dark and difficult waters. They would have been physically exhausted, especially based on what we know what just happened. They just fed however many people, right? They just came off this big high and then they were sent into a boat. They had to be tired. They had to be exhausted. Now it seems strange that they would be doing this in the middle of the night, in the middle of a windstorm. Why would this be happening? Why would they be doing this after this experience of the feeding of the 5,000? Now, to understand that, if we just look at the story, we got to take a step back and look at the verses right before to help us understand maybe a little bit why the disciples were in the boat. John chapter 6, verses 14 and 15. Therefore, when the people saw the sign, the feeding, which he had performed, they said, "This is truly the prophet who has come into the world." So Jesus, perceiving that they were intending to come and take him by force to make him king, withdrew again to the mountain by himself alone. The miracle that Jesus just performed, blew the people away. It just impressed them to no end. They were thinking to themselves, wait a second, this guy could bring us what we want. This guy could lead a revolution. This guy could upend the politics of the Roman Empire. This guy could be our king. Let's make him our king. They were going to grab him, and they were going to make him do what they wanted based on what they thought that he could do for them. But that's not how Jesus works, is it? Jesus doesn't just go along with the crowd, does he? So John tells us, Jesus recognizes what's happening, and he withdraws from the crowds. But he doesn't tell us what happens where the disciples go. The disciples, we find in verse 16, they go to the Sea of Galilee in the middle of the night, in the middle of a windstorm. As we dig into other accounts, this is where we kind of have to pull some other accounts to this story to piece some of this together. We find that Jesus isn't actually only going away by himself and just saying, you guys figure it out. No, Jesus actually sends them to the Sea of Galilee. He sends them into the dark waters. He sends them by boat into the choppiness of the waters. He sends them. This is what Matthew chapter 14 says. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. This phrase, Jesus made, or in other translations, he made, it carries this authoritative weight, meaning he's commanding them, you have to go. You have to go. This phrase, it carries authority. He's sending them, but it's not I think you guys should go. It's go. This isn't what John states. However, it's not much of a stretch, in my opinion, to understand that they weren't randomly deciding to go on a vacation in the middle of the night, in the middle of a windstorm, in the middle of a lake, because they thought that would be fun. They go because he sends them. And he sends them fully knowing what he's sending them into. Jesus sent them knowing full well that they would encounter darkness in the rough waters on the trip. My question, of course, in this series has been why? Why would you do that, Jesus? What are you trying to do? What's your end game here? What's the purpose? You know that you're sending them into the dark. You know that you're sending them into the rough waters. What is your purpose? It seems kind of cruel to me just on face value. Like, that's kind of a mean thing to do to your friends. Like, haha, good luck hanging out in the waters. Which leads me to believe, and Jesus isn't cruel, right? Jesus is love, so that can't be the reason. It leads me to believe that he's got to have some other reason for why he's doing what he's doing, other than he's just trying to send these guys out on a prank ride, or he's trying to impress them by being able to walk on water. I don't think that that's what he was doing. It's not random. If we've learned anything in John's gospel, it's like Jesus doesn't do anything randomly. Jesus knows exactly what he's doing every single time he does it. I believe that Jesus is why, his reason for doing this, the literal and figurative reason why Jesus sent them to a place that would be difficult was because it was the place that they needed to be in that moment. Even though they were going to be dealing with difficult things. I want to put forth an explanation of why Jesus sends them into the darkness and the rough waters from a pastor and theologian, Warren Wiersbe. He states this on this text. They were safer in the storm in God's will than on land with the crowds out of God's will. We must never judge our security on the basis of circumstances alone. I want to read it again. They were safer in the storm in God's will than on land with the crowds out of God's will. We must never judge our security on the basis of circumstances alone. Remember, the verse is leading right up until this experience. After the feeding of the 5,000, the crowds, they intended to take Jesus by force and make him king. Now, I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that some of the disciples would have been all about this plan. Think about this. John, the gospel writer John, the apostle John, who's the author of this gospel, he was a zealot. It's undetermined if he was actually a part of the organized group called the Zealots, who were an anti-Roman political movement group who were prone to violence, but I think it is fair to say that the gospel writer John would probably have been ready to rumble here. He would have been ready to go. Like, let's get Jesus in place so that we can overthrow the kingdom now. In Mark's Gospel, chapter 3, he recounts when Jesus called John and his brother James to come follow him, and it's Jesus who refers to these two brothers as the brothers of thunder. Some of the disciples would have been there, hearing the crowd stirred, and would have been like, yeah, let's go, Jesus, let's get crazy. Let's make you king. They would have been especially excited if the leader of their movement was going to be the leader of the movement. They would have been ready for this. I think given the chance, they would have been all in with the crowd. Wiersbe suggests that at this point in their spiritual walk, their ideas of the kingdom were still too national and political. They didn't have a kingdom mindset. They were worried about the there and now. Like they were engaged. They were like, we are going to overthrow the Roman government. So on the heels of the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000 that stirs the crowd to a frenzy, that leads them to calling Jesus to be their king of a political revolution, looking to forcefully put him in that position, John writes that Jesus realizes what's happening. He realizes what's going on with his own followers, knowing what he's working with, and he says, you guys got to go. Just go. He sends them. He commands them. He commands them into the rough waters, into the pitch black. Go. Get in the boat and don't turn around. Now, this might seem like it's an act that lacks compassion, but I think it's actually the exact opposite. It is out of his compassion He sends them into the darkness and the rough waters. He sends them as an expression of His grace for them. As I read John's account of the story, I think the takeaway of why Jesus sends is not so much because He wants to play a trick or He wants to just show them the craziness of how awesome He is by walking on the water. I don't think that's it. He sends them because it's an expression of grace, even though He knows He's sending them into darkness and rough waters. He sends them as an expression of grace. Now, church, the darkness and the places of rough waters in our own lives, it's really difficult to see what's actually happening sometimes, isn't it? We might not understand fully, but sometimes those places that we experience, those rough places, those dark places, those places might actually be Jesus sending us as an expression of His grace. Sometimes the tough places Jesus sends us into are better for us than we actually can see. It's better for us than what could be if we experience the alternative. Now, this is hard for us to explain, and it's hard for us to understand. Just as it was with the story, Jesus is saying, you got to go into these dark and rough waters. You just got to go. How many of us can point to situations really similarly in our lives? Where we go like, no, God, I don't want to go there because if I have to go there, I got to deal with the darkness of the world. I got to go into dark places in my life. I got to deal with the rough waters. I don't want to have to go there. And yet, God says, go. Out of an expression of His grace. Where are the places in your life where you say, Lord, why am I enduring this really difficult time? Well, I would put forth as maybe it's because the alternative could lead you into a far worse place. And that's hard to see. It's hard to see that sometimes Jesus sends or commands us into tough places that are dark and filled with rough waters as an expression of His compassion and His grace. It's hard to see that sometimes, but the reality is sitting here, sometimes that's the best place for us to be. And just as He sends with compassion, what we also find is He sees and He knows out of a place of compassion. Let's jump back into the story, John's account of the story. Again, verse 15. So Jesus, perceiving that they were intending to come and take Him by force to make Him king, withdrew again to the mountain by Himself. So as the disciples are sent out onto the lake, Jesus is up on the mountainside. He goes there to be alone. We're not told exactly what He does on the mountainside, but based on other accounts and other stories, I think it's safe to assume that He was going up to be with His Father, right? He was going up to pray and to meditate. He was going to be with His dad. To give ourselves some other context, we're going to pull from another gospel account of this specific story to help us understand maybe a little bit more about what was happening with Jesus in that time, to understand what He was dealing with, what He knew of the situation that was happening out on the lake. In Mark's telling of the story, we see that Jesus may have known more about what the disciples were struggling with. In Mark's telling of the story, the disciples were traveling across the Sea of Galilee while Jesus is on the mountainside, and Jesus, while on the mountainside, while with His Father, at the same time is fully aware of what's happening on the lake. This is what it says. Later that night, the boat was in the middle of the lake, and He was alone on land. This parallels John's story. Verse 48, though. He saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. This is really interesting. Jesus saw them dealing with it. The way Mark says this, it's not like Jesus is really high on the mountaintop and He can see down. That's not what He's saying. It's like Jesus can see them in His mind's eye. He's supernaturally there with them. This is a similar way, and we've been reading this in John's Gospel, that He saw and He knew the woman at the well. And it's the same thing that He did with the man who was paralyzed at the pool. He knew him, like he knew him. He never met him before, but He knew him. This is the exact same kind of concept. Jesus is supernaturally able to see things and hear things and perceive things that it doesn't make sense to us that He would be able to. Jesus sees things and knows things that that we can't really understand how we can see or how we can know. Which, in my estimation, just points that the gospel writers are saying Jesus is God, and that is important for us to know. So there he is on the side of the mountain. He's praying, he's communing with God, and Mark suggests that at the same time, he is fully present with the guys in the boat, struggling with the oars, struggling with the water, struggling in the darkness. Mark shows us that he had not forgotten about them, that he was not too busy with God to think of them. With every pull of the oars, the reality was that Jesus was looking on them with his love, and that he was present with them. When they were up against it, Jesus knew that, and he saw that, even though he wasn't there physically with them. How many of you know that reality? How many of you know that? When we're up against it, even though it might feel like we are alone in the dark and the rough waters of the life, the gospel writers show us, the gospel writers proclaim to us that Jesus sees us and knows us in those moments, even though it seems like he's far away. Every single time. Every single time. Every pull of the oar. I love that's how Mark suggests. Every pull of the oar, meaning like he was seeing them struggle with the pull. Every time. He might not make things easy on us, just like what was happening. He could have probably fixed that, right? But oftentimes, what we see in our own lives is that Jesus doesn't come down and just fix things, right? He oftentimes allows us to fight our own battles. And in those fighting of our own battles, he sees us and he hears us, he knows us. I like to say, this is probably like if y'all have kids and you're watching a sporting event, right? You're watching it happen, but you can't really do anything, right? You can't jump there and I don't know. I play volleyball, so I'm thinking of bumping the ball, right? You can't do that for them. You can't make them run faster. You can't make them think differently about the game. You're watching it happen. You were there present with them, but you can't do anything. You can't make the decisions for them. And when their team wins, you celebrate with your child. And if they lose, you're sad with and for your child. So I see this is how it happens. Jesus sees and hears. He's letting them fight their battles. He's letting them deal with the stuff that's difficult. He's watching. He's with them. He's in it. Your kids, they're playing a sport and you're like, ugh, That's how I feel like Jesus here is. Jesus sees them, but he can't fight their battles for them. He can't row the boat for them. But it's clear that he sees them and he knows their struggles, that he is there with them. And in this story, I think the Gospels show me that Jesus lovingly watches and sees and knows the things that we go through in the exact same way. The rough moments of the disciples that they were facing in the boat, they occurred with the loving eye of Jesus upon them the whole time. With every pull of the oar, Jesus knew their struggles. Church, I'm here to proclaim that the Gospels, just as they were true for the disciples then, is true for us today. Jesus sees us and knows us in every part of our lives, in the nice parts and in the rough parts in the darkness. Jesus sees and knows. The loving eye of Jesus is upon us always. So far in this story, we haven't even really jumped in the story, but we've seen that Jesus is the one who sends with compassion and grace, and that Jesus is one who watches and knows because of his compassion and love for us. What happens next makes me believe that although he knows and he watches from afar, he doesn't do so in a detached way. When our strength is failing, when the disciples' strength is failing after 6 to 8 hours of a grueling experience of rowing the boat, I can only imagine what their hands were looking like. They got to be tired. And when their strength was failing, in their weakness, Jesus is strong. When those he loves are failing, he shows up in real, tangible ways that sometimes takes us by surprise and can freak us out because of how miraculous it can be. That's what happens in this story. You know how this goes. Again, verse 18. A strong wind was blowing, and the waters grew rough. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I. Don't be afraid." So they're in the water 6 to 8 hours so far. They've rowed 3 to 4 miles, and Jesus chose to come to the rescue of the disciples, and he does so in this miraculous way. Matthew, Mark, and John all tell about this story. The disciples are struggling. The storms, the choppy water is crashing against the boat. It's just really difficult. They're in the middle of the lake. It's not that much fun. And all three of the stories do the exact same thing. The disciples saw Jesus, and they were terrified. John says they were afraid. Now, given the fact that it was dark, I wonder, just put yourself in the middle of this, right? They're like dealing with rowing the boat, and it's windy, and the waves are crazy, and they're rowing the boat, and all of a sudden, like, Jesus appears. I can only assume, based on this isn't what it says, but like, based on how I see it, is like Jesus is probably illuminated in some sort of way that would show up in the darkness, because it's dark. They're rowing, and Jesus shows up, and I assume that he's illuminated, and I assume this because of how Mark tells the story, that Mark says that it was like they saw a ghost. So I'm assuming it's like scary Jesus walking up to the boat, right? That's my reading. Don't go home and be like, Zach is a heretic. He reads in this. No, that's just, I like to do that sometimes. Makes sense. So those feelings of fear, terror, pass almost immediately as soon as Jesus says, "It is I." Upon speaking, the disciples, they hear Jesus' voice, and in doing so, Jesus' presence with them immediately brought peace to them. The statement is a callback, actually. What Jesus says is a callback to what God does at the burning bush. When Moses is trying to figure out who is this, what is this, and God's like, "I am who I am." This is a really similar language that Jesus uses here in this moment. Jesus says, "It is I," and we should hear it as like, "It is I, the I am." Jesus is saying something big here, hearkening back to the Exodus burning bush story. Jesus proclaims to the disciples, "It is I. I am the I am." Again, pointing toward his divinity. So John tells us this. John and the other gospel writers tell us that he sends, he watches, and when our strength is failing, he comes and he helps. Now, church, this is really crazy. The God that we get to hang out with, the God that we get to serve, the I am doesn't just command. The I am doesn't just watch. When in need, the great I am shows up and works for our good. And that can be scary sometimes, because when the I am shows up, sometimes it's scary. Sometimes it takes us by surprise, and let's be real. We can be afraid of the power of God when it shows up in our lives in the expected times and certainly in the unexpected times. We can find ourselves afraid when the great I am shows up, even if we're in a desperate place like the disciples were. So John is showing us that Jesus, he sends with grace, he knows and he watches us with loving eyes of compassion, and that he shows up and he works on our behalf, and sometimes that can be scary. And finally, in this section of chapter 6, John tells us that Jesus is wanting to bring us into a place of refuge, or this word haven, as we deal with the storms in our life. They saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I. Don't be afraid." Then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. It's one more display of Jesus' power. So he just came off walking on the water, right? And it says immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. I need you to think about this. This is like a miracle that doesn't get talked about ever. But they were in the middle of the lake. Jesus shows up, gets in the boat, and based on the text, based on how John remembered it, when he gets into the boat, and I don't know how long this actually happened, but he said immediately. And they were probably overcome. I think about John writing this story, and he's just like, yeah, of course we were immediately there. They're probably overcome by the power and the words and the action. They just saw Jesus walk on water, one of the craziest things that they would have ever seen. And they're no longer really trying to pay attention to the boat. Like, they welcome Jesus into the boat, and it says immediately, in a moment, they were at the shore. Here they are, struggling to row the boat in choppy waters, and once Jesus showed up, immediately they were done with all of their struggles. Immediately. A number of commentaries pointed out that when Jesus gets into the boat, what's actually happening here is he's enacting words of Scripture. He's enacting the Psalm. Psalm 107, this is what it says. They were glad when it grew calm, and he guided them to their desired haven. Think about the parallel of the Psalm and what Jesus has just done in the story. They were glad when it grew calm, and he guided them to their desired haven. Church, Jesus works to bring his people from a place of storm to a place of haven, a place of refuge. This text, I feel like, is a microcosm of who and what Jesus is and has done for so many of us. DJ, can you throw that psalm back up? I feel like this is our lives in the kingdom. They were glad when it grew calm, and he guided them to their desired haven. And then I like to throw like the John text in it. He immediately did that. It's not like he was just like, come on, I'll take you there. No, it immediately happens. I feel like this is a microcosm of who and what Jesus is, and who and what Jesus is for each of us in our own lives. This is the goal for so many of Jesus' efforts for so many of us, to bring us into a place of haven, to bring us calm so that we can experience haven or refuge. And John suggests it happens immediately when he steps into the boat. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm finding each week as we work through the Gospels, I'm overwhelmed by the different characteristics and different traits and qualities of Jesus. Even though I think I know this story really well, I like to look at it with just different eyes, because every single time that we're looking at these stories with different eyes, I think we get different characteristics and traits and qualities that have been refreshing to our soul. Each week we've gotten to know or relearn or hear anew just exactly who Jesus is. We've done this through the eyes of one of his best friends that can only tell us the story that Jesus immediately brought them to calm. Many of the qualities that John points out about his friend show us just how great he is. But stories like this one from the text today point out just how much he cares. Like how much he really cares. He doesn't just send, he doesn't just watch. He shows up and immediately brings us to haven. That's how much compassion he has. That is what his goal is for his friends and his followers. That's how much he cares for people like you and me. That he's willing to not just send like a king would, not just watch and see what happens like a king would, like an earthly king, but actually gets dirty with the things of this life and brings us to a place of refuge immediately. I am so thankful that the Jesus that we follow is the one who directs and guides and sends out of a place for his with his compassion and grace for us. I am so thankful that Jesus is the one who listens and sees, not because he just wants to see what's happening, but because of how much love he has for us. I'm so thankful that Jesus is the one who cares so much that he is willing to move mountains or walk on water in order to come to us in our time and need. I'm so thankful that Jesus is the one who efforts to bring us from a place of storms to a place of haven and refuge, and not just over time, but immediately. Thank God that that's the kind of king that Jesus is. Not the one that the people wanted him to be. Not the one that we probably would want him to be, but the king that we actually need. Thank God that this is the kind of Savior that God sent Jesus to be for us. He is the great I am who cares so deeply, acts so compassionately, and loves so recklessly for our sake. That is who Jesus is. I get goosebumps thinking about it. Thanks be to God that that is who Jesus is. Amen?